I suppose that within the larger, more encompassing arc of life, most of us have experienced a few dark moments when we've doubted whether life is really worth all of the woe and travail it so often entails. You know, those unsettling sorts of moments when we realize just how much senseless suffering, strife, and endless irritation there really is in this life. Basically, how much of it is filled with agonizing uncertainty, intolerable betrayal, vexing injustice, petty annoyance, and stupefying triviality. And so, at some point, it seems natural to ask, what, if anything, makes life worthwhile? Worth all of the effort, the pain, and the struggle? And so, with that question in mind, here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. As usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. As you can see, I'd like to explore the question of what makes life worthwhile with respect to 4 very general and interrelated areas. First, pleasure and happiness. Then, aesthetics and wisdom. Then, sociality. And finally, something I'm calling the adventure of transcendence. And at this point, I should probably also mention that I did an earlier video on antinatalism and ephilism, which explored what makes life not worthwhile. I'll try to remember to put a link to that earlier video in the description section of this video. But before launching into the content of this video, I'd like to thank the viewer who suggested today's topic. And he, or possibly she, goes by a name I'll probably mispronounce, and the name is Harmanveer Randhawa. Harmanveer Randhawa. I hope that's right. So many thanks, and a tip of the chapeau to you, Harmanveer Randhawa, wherever in this world you might be. So, yeah, what, if anything, makes life worthwhile? Well, we should probably recognize right away that there's a fair degree of variability in the possible answers to that question. After all, for some of us, what makes life worth living is, perhaps, delighting in the pleasures of the senses, maybe in the form of enjoying fine music and fine food. For Conan the Barbarian, it was to crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. For the philosophers of antiquity, like Aristotle, the answer lay in something like virtue ethics. For those of a more Christian persuasion, it's about revering Jesus and living according to the Bible's ethical edicts. For still others, it's probably more about the wonderful experience of falling in love, for instance. Basically, as the old adage goes, one man's meat is another man's poison. And so it is with the question of what makes life worthwhile. Furthermore, whatever it is that makes life worthwhile changes for most of us as we grow and develop over time. For instance, I'd say that when I was around 8, the answer probably revolved mostly around having a great baseball card collection and popping wheelies on my Stingray. A few years later, it had more to do with academic success, and a few years after that, it had mostly to do with having gratifying sexual experiences. You're probably getting the idea. So the upshot is that talking about what makes life worthwhile is probably irreducibly perspectival. It's a matter of seeing things from a certain point of view, culturally, historically, and personally. And the same is undoubtedly true of all the insights I'll be sharing with you in this video. They're mostly about what has made life worthwhile to me, both in the past and at age 61, which is where I am right now. But despite that inevitable degree of variability, my hope is that no matter where you are in life, sharing my insights might help you grapple with Harmanveer Randhawa's question from your own perspective. Of course, that's not a guarantee, it's just a hope. Anyhow, with those qualifiers in mind, let's begin. So, what makes life worthwhile? Well, I'd say that the first and most obvious answer has to do with pleasure and/or happiness. I'll call that the hedonistic answer, and it basically goes like this. Sure, our lives may involve a fair amount of woe and travail, but they also offer us plenty of beautiful, uplifting, and pleasurable moments. For instance, Consider all of the great successes and victories you've experienced in your life, or all of the wonderful, delectable meals you've eaten, or maybe all of the ecstatic sexual experiences you've enjoyed through the years. And when it seems like those sorts of positive experiences outweigh the negative ones, well, it's pretty easy to say that life is worthwhile, basically because its delights outweigh its torments. And while that sort of hedonistic calculus is undoubtedly part of life's larger equation, it's not really an adequate answer, at least not on its own. That's partly because sometimes the most painful, excruciating experiences actually turn out to be the most valuable and worthwhile ones. For instance, think about how much we learn and grow from some of the painful things we have to endure. Isn't it true that at least some of the time, suffering ends up being one of our best teachers in this world? For instance, an example. Consider the failed love relationships you might have experienced in the past. I bet that some of them involved a fair amount of torment. In fact, probably mountains of broken hopes and dreams, and entire oceans of toxicity, deceit, betrayal, disgust, and self-recrimination, and possibly even outright hatred. And yet, I bet that at least some of those awful experiences have taught you some invaluable things about how life works. Some profound and indelible lessons inscribed forever in the living book of your existence. Lessons about what you really want in life, for instance, and what you really don't. And isn't it true that suffering teaches us important lessons not only in that particular area, but in many others too? In the work world, in our relationships with our friends, in the financial world, etc., etc. But if that's the case, then why should we be so quick to say that life is worthwhile in proportion to the amount of happiness and pleasure we experience? The fact is, speaking of pleasure, life really isn't that simple, because at points it's also worthwhile insofar as we've suffered in some fruitful ways. However, a deeper and possibly less intuitive problem with the hedonistic answer has to do with the fact that pleasure and pain are almost always more deeply interwoven than popular opinion would have it. For instance, consider the case of addictive behavior, where short-term pleasure predictably ends up generating even more long-term pain. And while that may seem to be a bit of an anomalous example, in reality, a lot of life's delights are governed by that same basic logic. Enjoying lots of fine food can easily lead to agonizing health problems over time. Indulging in the pleasures of commodity culture can easily generate long-term misery in the form of chronic debt. The joys of unbridled sexual libertinage usually entail the risk of disease. You're probably getting the picture. Basically, as the old school band The Eagles once sang, every form of refuge has its price. And so it is with seeking refuge in a lot of life's pleasures. In the end, they exact their price, often without our even being aware that it's happening. But of course, that's hardly a novel realization. Sigmund Freud fathomed the truth of it in his ideas about Eros and the Thanatos drives. That was 100 years ago. Or, as Shakespeare put it over 300 years before that, quod me alit, me extinguit. Little Latin for you, which means that which feeds me also extinguishes me. And that same realization also lies near the heart of hubris, as the classical Greek tragedians depicted it. You know, the idea that flying too close to the sun, like Icarus did, can very easily bring about our catastrophic undoing. But my main point is that our pleasure and happiness are almost always in an intimate reciprocal relation to our pain and unhappiness, which once again means that the straightforward hedonistic answer to the question of life's value isn't really such a great answer after all. And at this point, I think that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, I guess among others, has a much better response. In The Birth of Tragedy, he rather famously proclaims, "It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified." Of course, it's always tempting to try to reduce aesthetic experience to simple pleasure. Perhaps of a more sophisticated sort than average, but pleasure nonetheless. But to me, that doesn't seem very accurate. The reason is that aesthetic experience isn't limited merely to beauty and pleasure. It just as easily traverses the terrain of ugliness and pain. For instance, consider Pablo Picasso's Guernica, or Edvard Munch's The Scream, or in the literary sphere, how about Franz Kafka's The Castle or The Trial? Or if you prefer to think in terms of everyday life, well, once again, consider how much we actually gain from knowing life's ugliness and pain. Basically, the more unsettling and disquieting side of aesthetic experience. And probably nothing crystallizes the darker regions of aesthetic experience better than the reality of death itself. And isn't it true that the silence of the desolate graveyard, its broken tombstones standing like legions of abandoned sentinels in the cold, misty night, that terrible silence conjures a dark aesthetic of its own? And when you think about it, isn't it also true that life's greater wisdom is often born in places like that? In our forbidding shadows, in the fugitive whispers of what frightens us the most, in what we find repulsive and abhorrent, both in ourselves and in the world. That's because we hardly ever find wisdom when we're just lounging around in our comfort zones and safe spaces, or in the sunny illumination of our happiness and pleasure. Instead, we become wise mostly when we're brought to the unsettling outer boundary of what defines and delimits our existence, when we have to change our relation to life itself in order to feel like we have a chance of surviving. Basically, if we want to become wise, it's important to know the night and not only the day. And that's why the aesthetic answer is better than the simple hedonistic answer. It's because life is more worthwhile when we're able to navigate it with wisdom, with a fuller recognition of the reality into which we've been thrown, with all of its ecstatic joys and all of its bitter sorrows intact, all of its soaring beauty balanced against all of its hideousness and pain. So, in that regard, life is worthwhile because it offers us the chance to move towards something like wisdom, as well as the aesthetic that accompanies it. However, I'd say that even all of that is still not a complete answer to the riddle of what makes life worthwhile, because a sizable fraction of what remains has to do with the social realm. You know, the fact that we're alongside our fellow travelers in this world, which would include other people as well as all other sentient beings. In other words, anything that perceives at all. From that perspective, it's not really enough just to hoard our wisdom for ourselves. As Nietzsche once again puts it, this time in Zarathustra, "You great star, what would your happiness be had you not those for whom you shine?" In other words, what do our wisdom and accomplishments really matter if they serve only ourselves? If they fail to reach beyond the narrow confines of our own self-interest and self-involvement? And isn't it true that the sense of companionship, basically the experience of being alongside our fellow travelers on planet Earth, is a pretty big part of that? For instance, doesn't a sizable fraction of what makes life worthwhile have to do with loving and being loved, or with the passions we feel for each other more generally? And isn't it a tremendous boon in this life to be able to give our gifts freely to the people around us and to receive their gifts in return. In fact, I'd say that somewhat contrary to popular opinion, giving gifts to others is actually one of the best things we can do for ourselves. Mostly because it provides us with a deeper way of consummating our time in this world than we'd otherwise have. And receiving gifts graciously from others is also a way of automatically giving something back to the people who are being generous with us. Because at that point, we're occasioning their chance to experience the fulfillment of giving. And of all of the things we can give to the people around us, I'd say that some of the best ones have to do with things like kindness, empathy, honesty, and acceptance. So personally, I'd say that sociality and the reciprocal dynamic between giving and receiving are part of what makes life worthwhile. Which, by the way, is also a big part of why I make these videos, especially since I never monetize them or lard them with advertisements for Jell-O pudding pops or maybe 4x8 sheets of plywood or seek out corporate sponsorships. I think you get the idea. It's not because I'm so spiritually elevated and evolved that I no longer am affected by greed. That ain't it. It's because I'm so greedy and so unevolved that I'm just not content with something as paltry as a cash payoff. Anyhow, in my view, expecting a paycheck for telling the truth just makes us beholden to whoever's holding the purse strings, which usually ends up warping and compromising the whole project of telling the truth in the first place. But I digress. So let's get back to the question of what makes life worthwhile. I'd say that beyond sociality, my final answer would have to do with experiencing life as an adventure. And an adventure in the deepest and most encompassing way possible. Of course, that sort of thing would involve the broad panoply of life's reality, which would include the three areas we've already mentioned. But for me, more than anything else, it would also have to do with transcendence, which is to say, with the experience of growing and developing as human beings, with moving ever closer to our unique and luminous destinies in this world. In other words, it has to do with learning to spread the wings of our souls, with learning to fly, figuratively speaking, and then with feeling the wild wind of time itself beginning to carry us aloft into those terrifying and beautiful skies where everything becomes effulgent and brilliant, where everything glimmers with intimations of the infinite. And while all of that may sound wonderful, I suspect that it also involves a certain irreducible fraction of danger and fear. And because of that, experiencing transcendence actually demands courage, a kind of intrepidity at the deepest levels of our being. But when you think about it, what would adventure, or hell, maybe life more generally, be without danger, without risk, without the sense that there's something at stake and teetering precariously in an uncertain balance? And in the case of transcendence, what's at stake is nothing less than life as we've known it thus far. That's because the adventure of transcendence can easily carry us far beyond what's familiar and predictable and leave us transported and transfigured in a world that seems both strange and familiar at the same time. A world born anew because we've been born anew. And in that regard, the palpable danger of transcendence basically has to do with our fear of annihilation. Our fear of dying as a small being, moment by moment, as Shunryu Suzuki puts it. Lovely quote. Which is why transcendence often demands real courage. Because at some level, most of us are afraid of dying, not only literally, but more importantly, figuratively. Of course, on the other end of the spectrum, it's always a lot easier and a lot safer to live an unadventurous life. You know, to muddle through the tedium of it all until we can finally slip into a nice, cool grave after a few decades of quiet desperation. And that safe posture toward life isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially since some of us are probably more constitutionally suited for the adventure of transcendence than others are. And so, at some level, it comes down to a very personal choice. But for me, I'd say that part of what makes life worthwhile has a lot to do with the delicious and perilous uncertainty of it all, and with our trembling willingness to face that reality, and then our willingness to learn to live accordingly. But at this point, I guess I feel like some qualifiers are probably necessary. First, it's probably tempting to think that we should immediately start engaging the mechanisms of commodity culture to enhance our sense of an adventurous, transcendent life. Maybe we should see if there are any special transcendent sneakers for sale on Amazon.com. Or maybe we should enroll in some sort of class or training for it. Or maybe we should take up skydiving, or possibly buy a ticket to Nepal where we can take in the rarefied spiritual air of the Himalayan mountains. But hate to tell you, but none of that is actually necessary. In fact, a lot of it is probably just another distraction. That's because the adventure of transcendence isn't about buying the right shoes or driving the right car or saying the right things or traveling to the right countries. Of course, it could involve any of those things, but the point is that they're not actually required. What's required is to learn to open the portals of our perceptual fields wide enough so that we can experience what life is actually showing us. Fully and completely, right here and right now. The fact is that the whole adventure of transcendence can start with something as simple as encountering the reality of a single grain of sand, or maybe just petting a cat, or even just feeling our breath moving in and out of our bodies for a moment or two, but to feel it fully and completely, without secretly hankering for something else, to be entirely present and accepting and involved in whatever we're experiencing, rather than doing what most of us usually do, which is to fill our consciousness with thoughts like, after this, I guess I'm going to have a pizza. And once again, there's absolutely no shame in thinking about pizza, because that's a very human and very understandable thing to do. But on the other hand, that fact doesn't mean that we have to accept distraction as the upper limit of our time in this world. You know, the poet William Blake once famously opined that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. From that perspective, the adventure of transcendence is about cleansing the doors of our perception over time, and then assuming our place among the other denizens of the infinite. So, the first qualifier would be that the adventure of transcendence requires no special situation or occasion, because the special occasion is already happening. Even as you're watching this video. Surprise! Anyhow, the second qualifier has to do with this. When I'm talking about how experiencing danger is part of the larger adventure of transcendence, I'm talking about cultivating a strategic sense for danger, which is not the same thing as being stupid. In fact, they're not even close. That's because sometimes our fears are actually intelligent, especially insofar as they can alert us to things that we should probably avoid. So if we're hiking in the mountains and an avalanche starts happening, well, our fear is probably telling us that it would be pretty stupid not to get out of the way. But of course, at other points, our fears are little more than our prisons. the very thing that keeps us living lives that are far smaller and far more constricted than they really need to be. And so developing a strategic sense for danger, and I'm emphasizing that word strategic, means being able to tell when the time is right to step beyond our fears and when it's not. And while that may sound pretty easy, it's actually not easy at all, especially since the kinds of fears that needlessly imprison us usually appear to be very real and very well justified. Anyhow, at this point I should probably move toward ending this video by offering you a few suggestions about how you can make that distinction more accurately. And I believe that the starting point mostly has to do with developing self-awareness. That is, with becoming mindfully and perceptively cognizant of what's really going on inside of ourselves. And here in the West, and more specifically in the United States where I live, that's not such an easy thing to do, especially since there are many powerful cultural forces dragging us in the exact opposite direction, into the vast, teeming, trackless ocean of endless distraction, usually disguised as entertainment. In fact, I'd say that to care about self-awareness in a world like ours almost requires a special act of defiance, a kind of personal rebellion against our world's myriad seductions. But beyond that, I'd say that the best way of cultivating self-awareness is by making an active practice out of it. It's a little like learning to play a musical instrument. It's pretty much impossible to get good at it as long as we're resting easily in our fantasies and wishful thinking. Instead, getting good at music, or perhaps the music of self-awareness, requires developing a familiarity and intimacy with it through endless hours of sustained practice, probably over a span of many years. It means making thousands upon thousands of dumb mistakes and blunders, and being willing to recognize and live through them, and to learn something from them along the way. Consequently, getting good at music, or again at self-awareness, also means learning to endure times of self-doubt and hopelessness. Moments when it seems like we should probably just give up. And when we're thoroughly beleaguered by that sort of fatalism, it means stepping forward anyhow and taking up our imperfect practice, possibly for the 10,000th time, against all odds. Perhaps out of sheer bloody-mindedness, as the British like to say. However, to be able to endure all of that, it's important to allow ourselves to fall thoroughly in love with what we're doing, whether it's learning an instrument or cultivating self-awareness, so madly and deliriously in love with our practice that it eventually becomes just another natural part of everyday life. Maybe like brushing our teeth or tying our shoes, rather than some sort of unpleasant, intrusive burden. And here, I should stress that it's important to fall in love with the practice itself, rather than with the prospect of eventually arriving at some sort of destination, which, if we're honest about it, may or may not come to fruition, especially since life can be a very capricious and unpredictable thing. And who can say where it will and where it won't end up taking us? Anyhow, as I've mentioned possibly too many times in my previous videos, I personally find meditation to be a great way of practicing self-awareness, and consequently a way of developing the ability to distinguish between our reality-based fears and those that haunt us like phantoms in the harrowing midnight of our self-inflicted debilitation and paralysis. But hey, meditation is just my thing, and it's important for you to do you. After all, you're living your life and not mine. And I'm sure that there are many other great ways of cultivating self-awareness in this world. The important thing is to find the one that works well for you. Anyhow, I guess that those are the sorts of things that make life worthwhile, at least to me. Part of it has to do with pleasure and happiness. But a little surprisingly, another part has to do with their exact opposites. Beyond that, aesthetic experience and moving toward wisdom make life worthwhile, as does sharing the journey with other people, and ultimately, with all sentient beings. And finally, the adventure of transcendence, which I would say is tantamount to the adventure of life itself, makes life worthwhile. And yeah, all of those elements are certainly interrelated, and they definitely don't constitute an exhaustive list. But hell, that's okay. One of the great constants of life is that there's always something more on the horizon. However, in the final analysis, I'd say that of all of the times and places where life seems truly worthwhile, the most important is, well, it's in simple everyday life. In the smile of a friend, for instance, or the sound of rain on the roof. And who knows, perhaps even in making these videos for you. After all, I think that there's room in this universe for that. Anyhow, that's how it is for me. Subject is always to change, possibly later today. So, yeah, thanks to each and every one of you for taking the time to watch and listen. I definitely appreciate your time and your attention. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.